It's a pleasure and an honor to welcome Professor Birgit Meyer to Columbia. She's here speaking to us today as part of a new, still relatively new, 3-year project funded by the Henry Luce Foundation called Rethinking Public Religion in Africa and South Asia, which I'm running with my colleague Catherine Ewing, and many others are involved on campus. It's based in the Institute for Religion, Culture, and Public Life, but it has links as well to the Institute for African Studies and the South Asia Institute. And today's event is also co-sponsored by the Anthropology Department and ICER, so I want to thank them for that. So the Rethinking Public Religion project is based on the premise that our understandings and conceptualizations of this thing, public religion, rely on too many settled assumptions. It is not so much, or really our interest really, to focus on the ways in which we can mark the decline of secularization theory and note religion's return. What is of more interest to us are, again, not even really the conceptions of religion and religiosity, but public and modes of publicity. That's a large part of what we're trying to focus on. Anthropologists and many others are very good at questioning the category of religion, but they don't always take the same level of scrutiny and apply it to the concept of publicity. That's part of what we're trying to do. What are the conditions and qualities of being public in both conceptual and contextual terms? Now, if most anthropologists don't do this, Birgit Meyer is certainly one of the exceptions to the rule. Someone whose careful attention to both ethnographic detail and critical theory provides some of the richest treatments we have of religious publicities. For several decades now, her commitment to Ghana, among Ewe communities to start, and increasingly the urban mix of Accra, has resulted in a number of path-breaking studies, including her 2 monographs, Translating the Devil, Religion and Modernity Among the Ewe in Ghana, published in 1999, and Sensational Movies, Vision, Video, and Christianity in Ghana, published in 2015, as well as dozens of essays and articles, many of which have offered seminal contributions to our understandings of conversion and temporality, sensations and the body, and material religion, among other topics. Professor Meyer studied cultural anthropology under Johannes Fabian at the University of Amsterdam and went on to hold posts at that university and then the Free University of Amsterdam in the anthropology department. Since 2011, she has been professor of religious studies at Utrecht, during which time she has expanded her focus well beyond Christianity and indeed pressed for thinking beyond traditions altogether. She has also, along the way, picked up an enviable number of prizes, honors, and awards, including from the Humboldt Foundation, the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the Spinoza Award. To top this all off, and with no pressure, she is an incredibly engaging speaker. And so, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Birgit Meyer.
Yeah, thank you very much, Matthew, for this very nice introduction, which makes it perhaps a bit difficult for me to live up to the expectation it may generate. Thank you also for making me part of this project, for thinking along. And I would like to say that, the piece I will present today is a kind of piece in process, in progress. And I very much invite comments, questions, criticisms, and so on for the discussion. The secularization thesis ceased to offer the dominant analytical frame in the study of religion in modern societies some decades ago and was replaced by an understanding that the secular produces, facilitates, and regulates religion. For me, the question how to grasp the dynamics and multiplicity of contemporary religious environments within nation states and regions in the global north and global south, as well as across, is one of the biggest empirical and conceptual challenges faced by the study of religion today. Working in an interface of anthropology and religious studies since 2011, I became increasingly aware of certain limitations of my own focus on Christianity in Ghana, as well as of the limitations of conceptual approaches that study specific religious traditions without paying much attention to the wider religious field. While anthropologists are well equipped to gain deep insights into particular groups and movements, in my experience, it is more difficult and less common to study the dynamics of such configurations from a wider angle and in a relational perspective. Doing so requires to move beyond edges and margins of a religious tradition, where it rubs against others in a limbo of an in-between space, a Zwischenraum, where difference is negotiated, ascribed, and denied. For religion comes in the plural. I think that this multiplicity should be the starting point for our research by default. Each attempt to study religion across its multiple manifestations is, of course, historically situated. The fact that the term religion in the slipstream of colonization and missionization gained currency across the world through various, albeit imperfect, translations that were propelled back into the academic study of religion cautions against its unproblematic use. And yet scholars, whether in the framework of religious studies or anthropology and sociology of religion, obviously cannot afford to let go the term religion, if only because it designates the subject matter of their inquiries and brings them together. So I agree with David Chidester that religion and religious are problematic and yet unavoidable terms and offer, I quote him, occasions for critical and creative reflection on problems of interpretation, explanation, and analysis in the humanities and social sciences. In this spirit, the focus of this lecture is the public presence of religion in pluralist configurations in Ghana, where I have conducted research over a long time span, and in the Netherlands, where I live and work, and where I have supervised quite a lot of papers and theses that focus on religion in the Netherlands. For long, I felt that my research on religion in Ghana and my being part of Dutch society and academia were worlds apart. De facto, however, these regions have been entangled for centuries, and the fact that from a European, though emphatically not from an African perspective, they are taken as separate, signals not only a problem of amnesia, it also betrays a problematic scholarly mindset grounded in epistemologies that situate Africa and religion in Africa at a temporal and spatial distance from the presumed center, which is the West. Bringing research on Ghana and the Netherlands together is still new for me, and I have to admit it's also rather experimental. Certainly, there are big differences between the ways in which religion is manifested in the public domains of both societies. Whereas in Ghana, Christianity and to some extent Islam have an incredible material, visible and sonic presence, in the Netherlands, mainstream Christianity is declining and many churches... Okay, I messed up my PowerPoint, but that doesn't matter. Sorry. In the Netherlands, mainstream Christianity is declining and many churches are being closed down, while a lot of public attention is given especially to the construction of new mosques, with Muslims, however, only making for 5% of the population in the Netherlands. But it would be mistaken to ontologize this difference, yes, by recurring to contrasts according to which African people are incurably religious and live in never secular worlds, whereas Westerners live in an ever more disenchanted world. The Ghanaian and Dutch state both have a secular constitution, and in both religions are accommodated with a specific secular form, within a specific secular formation that is worthwhile to be unpacked in some detail. How secular is understood and operative in these settings is to be established through research, with the Brazilian anthropologist Emerson Giambelli, and here is the quote, I see political secularism as the ways in which the state relates to religion in the sense of establishing a place for it in society by taking into account the role played by various social agents, including religious ones, in the processes of shaping such relations. One way to explore such relations and regulations in action is to focus on the material and corporeal ways through which religion goes public and becomes tangible. And in preparing for this lecture, I went through my work on public religion in Ghana and bumped, even a bit to my surprise, into the closing statement of a piece about religion in the public sphere in Africa, which I wrote 10 years ago. And I won't read it for you. You see it here. I was in a way happy to know that indeed over the past 10 years or so, I have pursued this program through deploying a material approach to religion. But what changed with my move from anthropology to religious studies is a much stronger concern to think about and study religion by taking into account pluralist religious environments as well as transregional entanglements between Europe, Africa, and other parts of the world. And this lecture is part of my attempt to move further into this direction so as to better understand how the tangible manifestation of religion in public spaces is regulated, facilitated, and negotiated in pluralist settings grounded in secular formations. In the first part, I will explain why and how a focus on publicly present religious matters may offer a viable entry point for research and analysis. Secondly, turning to Ghana, I will foreground two religious matters that come to the fore with the prominence of Pentecostalism, discarded idols on the one hand, and the presidential project of a national cathedral. Third, turning to the Netherlands, the focus will be on religious matters that emerged as the material sediments of unchurching and the closing of churches. How can a comparative take on religious matters in pluralist public domains be of use to flesh out fresh concepts and approaches for research on pluralist religious environments in the interface of anthropology and religious studies? This is the major concern of our joint research project, Religious Matters in an Entangled World, which I could recently set up at Utrecht University. The point is to take religion seriously as a social cultural phenomenon that matters in the world through gathering people around a shared imaginary, which points beyond the here and now and yet is present in the world by materializing through all sorts of material items which are perceived, sensed, acted with, and thought about. Its guiding idea is that a focus on religious matters could be a productive empirical entry point into the multiplicity and at times uneasy coexistence of different religious and secular groupings in public spaces within modern secular formations in societies across Europe and Africa. Religious matters include both the tangible manifestation of religious forms, including images, objects, buildings, dress, food, and so on, in public spaces, and matters of concern about this presence in public debate and policy. The regional foci are mainly Africa and Europe and their entangled histories, and we seek to analyze religious matters by situating them in a wider environment and in relation to the policies through which religion is accommodated and regulated by the state and debated and contested in society. As noted, the manifestation of religion and the freedom of religion in a modern secular context is subject to long-standing legal and political regulations, yielding particular regimes for ordering how a religion is enabled to be present in a particular society and how not. To grant the freedom of belief is easily compatible with the supposed proclaimed neutrality of the public sphere and the relative invisibility of religion therein, but to grant the freedom of religious expression in a wider material sense is a different issue altogether, as the many contestations and debates about religious matters indicate. In a methodological sense, a focus on religious matters leads right into the rise and negotiation of conflicts around items marking religious presence, including buildings of cathedrals and mosques, the use of visual representations, body practices, food issues, and so on. Here one can distinguish between rather mundane religious matters, such as dress, food, body practices, that are central to a particular religious identity, and religious matters that have an extraordinary status and that they are not only present in the world, but also point beyond it, and I find the latter of special interest. As pointed out in my work, I understand religion as a practice of mediation between humans and a professed invisible beyond, to which multiple material media, which I understand in a quite broad sense, are intrinsic. In this context, I launched the concept sensational form as a heuristic, sensitizing research instrument to grasp the genesis and working of religious sensations. A material corporeal portal that opens up in an authorized manner towards a professed beyond. Sensational forms vest buildings, objects, images, food with a sacred surplus for their beholders. By this I mean that such artifacts, while being physical and often human-made objects in the ordinary world, are framed and experienced as extraordinary and hence treated with care and caution by obeying certain restrictions, and thus all the more prone to be desecrated by outsiders involuntarily or through aggressive, willful acts. And by the same token, they are difficult to be handled when the religious tradition in which they were situated is fading, appearing as some kind of what Irene Stenks called sacred waste, as is the case with the so-called fetishes and idols that were abandoned when their custodians converted to Christianity in Ghana, or with Catholic devotional objects and churches that become superfluous with increasing unchurching in the Netherlands. Of course, the material artifacts that harbinger a divine or spiritual presence do not do so by themselves, but in the framework of a specific religious tradition that authorizes and authenticates them as suitable to do so. This is to say that they should not be analyzed from the outset by taking for granted the purifying categories that distinguish between objects and people here and beyond, but rather be approached as exponents of what Paul Baschu, for instance, calls in-betweenness. In this sense, religious matters, those mediating in other world, as well as those employed for mundane purposes, can best be analyzed as nodes in a complex social, spatial, and temporal entanglement, rather than simply as specimens of material culture. As different religious traditions privilege and authorize different religious matters, a focus on these matters offers a productive entry point into conflicts within and between religious traditions, as well as between religious and secular stances and religious transformations through time. And now we move to Ghana. It is obvious that studying religion in Ghana is not simply confined to a conceptual space within Africa, but enshrines a long history of African, European economic, social, political, and conceptual connections. How to analyze religion in a society in which the concept of religion is absent? Louis Brenner asked poignantly. As he points out, external European concepts define what is meant by religion in Africa. This involves the use of a Christian concept of religion that emphasizes belief, knowledge, and cosmology at the expense of the practical dimension of people's encounters with gods and spirits. His critique resonates with Assad's point that the anthropology of religion is indebted to post-Enlightenment Protestant views of religion that are mistaken as universal and thus tend to misrepresent Islam as well as indigenous traditions. Notwithstanding the initial lack of African terms that could serve as an equivalent for religion, religion was successfully introduced across Africa with huge consequences. As David Chillister put it succinctly, before coming under colonial subjugation, Africans had no religion. After local control was established, however, they were found to have had a religious system after all. Asserting the deep religiosity of Africans and tracing it back to what was termed African traditional religions, the work of scholars as Mbiti, Buzia, Opoku, and Parenda resonated with the search for a pan-African personality launched by Nkrumah and Senghor's project of negritude in the 1950s and 60s. Their assertions of an essential Africanness may be a resource for pride and self-esteem, but also come with a price. In the current global configuration, in which Europe has gone through a process of remarkable unchurching, Christian believers' characterization of Africans as being notoriously religious has a weird ring of rightful stubbornness. At least they still uphold faith in a deplorably unreligious world. Africa has come to stand for the future of Christendom in the sense of Jenkins, and is the place from which a reverse mission is unleashed to re-evangelize Europe. And indeed, in Amsterdam, I often come across African preachers, many of whom take this city as a Sodom and Gomorrah. As Jan Platvoet and Henk van Rinsum pointed out, the ontologization of Africa as religious purports a problematic, I quote, mythic dichotomy of religious Africa versus secular Europe, which affirms a false opposition of us and them mapped onto the religious secular distinction. Obviously, this stance continues to produce Africa as Europe's eternal other within the with the religion-secular binary serving as the ground for their separation. This implies, as Matthew Engelke observed, that Africa features barely in current research on secularity and secular formations. An idea of Africa as still enchanted or as never secular is problematic not only because it denies Africa coevalence with secular Europe, but also because it affirms long-standing stereotypes. And this stands in the way of exploring actual entanglements and neglects that many modern states in Africa actually do have a secular constitution and relate to religion in a secular framework. And how this happens is to be explored through research. Let me start with a sketch of Ghana's pluralist religious environment, which consists of, as it is always said, traditional religion, Islam, and Christianity. Current school books, and the three religions are represented, school books for moral and religious education consistently refer to the three main religions, Christianity, Islam, and traditional religion, in equalizing terms. Looked at from a secular standpoint, these religions are shown to take alternative paths towards the same goal, setting standards for good or bad behavior and character of citizens. They require mutual acceptance and respect. This harmonious picture of a symmetrical pluralism and wishful, peaceful coexistence hides significant differences and antagonisms between these three religions that are grounded in the introduction of the concept religion and by implication the secular in colonial times. Islam was present prior to the arrival of Christian missionaries, and several chieftaincies in the north were Islamized, and Islam also spread through trade across the region now called Ghana and beyond, leading various zongos, quarters for strangers, that hosted Muslim migrants. It coexisted with what is now in retrospect termed African traditional religion, which in pre-colonial times was part of a whole configuration in which politics, religion, and the social were not yet separated, and which was characterized by an open attitude towards the spirits of others and adopted many elements from Islam and later on also Christianity. This was a world in which the spirits were immanent to the here and now and thus enmeshed with all domains of life, and which became compartmentalized with the establishment of colonial rule. Spreading backed by colonial rule, Christian missions acted as game changers. Christianity was presented as a civilized religion superior to indigenous forms of worship that were now recast as heathendom and pushed to the margins and into seclusion. Conversion implied, on the one hand, the rise of new religious matters, churches, schools, Christian villages, dress styles, and on the other hand, generated a lot of waste. Objects and images associated with the sphere of the spirits were rejected by many as idols or fetishes and burned or shipped to ethnographic museums in Germany and also in the Netherlands. Traditional worshippers became a minority, though many Christians clandestinely visited indigenous priests for the sake of protection and success. The configuration that emerged with colonialism still shapes the current religious environment, with Christians now forming the majority, more than 70% according to the 2010 census, Muslims about 17%, and traditionalists making for a tiny 5%. Especially in the aftermath of democratization, Pentecostals seized the possibilities to manifest themselves as a major force in the public domain, populating public space with Pentecostal signboards, posters, stickers, and sounds. Gradually, Muslims, who were long regarded as northerners and thus as less developed and educated from a southern Christian perspective, followed suit and manifest themselves more explicitly through the construction of new mosques, as well as changing dress styles associated with current Islamic piety movements. And while traditional religion remains marginalized and despised, recently some priests started to use social media to represent themselves and counter the Pentecostal assaults. In the slipstream of the rise of Pentecostal Christianity as a public and material force, the rejection of objects and practices, including dancing and drumming, associated with indigenous religion, is still going on. And Dr. Dike Olukoya is a very prominent preacher in Nigeria, as well as much read in the Netherlands. Ghanaian and Nigerian video films, as I tried to show in my book on sensational movies, also affirm this negative iconoclastic stance. While there are marked responses on the part of priests serving indigenous deities who protest against being dismissed as Satanists and idol worshippers, iconoclasm is still undertaken, in part with the active consent of custodians of shrines, but in part not. So from the material perspective taken here, it is clear that the rise of new, especially Pentecostal religious matters, including huge churches, is accompanied by the discarding of traditional stuff. This is especially intriguing as certain elements of tradition have been reframed as traditional medicine or cultural heritage by the post-colonial state. In both cases, this reframing separates the spiritual or religious aspects of tradition from their mundane aspects, and in so doing, medicine and heritage emerge as secular forms, and of course, this is contested, especially on the part of Christians who still see spirits at work. The stakes can be explained by briefly turning to the frame of heritage or Sankophaism that was launched by Nkrumah and resuscitated in the Rawlings regime and employed very strongly in advertising Ghana also for heritage tourism. The heritage frame involves a shift of the value of traditional objects and practices from what, with Walter Benjamin, we could perhaps call their cult value to their exhibition value. However, for many Christian beholders, this was and is too big a step, as for them the spirits and gods come alive in these things, reason why they cannot become mere heritage items for display. Framed as heritage by the state, these religious matters are thus embedded in a memory project that many Christians do not want to value, as it evokes a past from which they want to dissociate themselves. How does the Constitution that was adopted in 1992 in the wake of the country's embracement of democracy relate to this pluralist configuration, and how does it intervene in religious matters? While it uses, in the name of the Almighty God as preamble, the Constitution explicitly grants every citizen the, and I quote, freedom to practice any religion and to manifest such practice, but this is subject to, and I quote again, controls in the interest of public health, morality, and so on. So as elsewhere, including the Netherlands, here the regulation of religion by the state is legitimated, and regulation in fact occurs regularly in refusal of medical treatment by staunchly Christian parents for children, certain traditional practices that curtail the rights of individuals, such as the Chokosi case that occurred some years ago, issues of religious noise-making in periods in which this is tabooed from a traditional perspective, and so on. I cannot go into such cases here, but want to focus on the question how the secularism embraced by the Constitution relates to the strong presence, overwhelming presence, I would say, of religion in society, in which atheism is virtually absent, and polemical secularist stances that detest religion, which we come across a lot in the Netherlands, do not at all come forward. They may exist, but they are not articulated in public. As law scholar Kofi Kwashiga puts it, Ghana is a religious nation, but at the same time secular in the sense that the same constitution prohibits the elevation of any religious organization into a state religion. While there is no state religion and the state is supposed to stand above the various religions, at the same time the government and politicians engage with religion, especially Christianity. During my recent visit to Ghana in early January, there was much debate about the initiative launched by the President Nana Akufo-Addo in 2016 for building a national cathedral on state-owned land in the center of Accra. He repeatedly declared in public that he pledged to build a national cathedral as a gesture of thanksgiving to God for becoming president, and he regards this as his personal project, which he openly supported with a personal donation of 100,000 CDs last December, so that is around 20,000 euros. According to him, this construction project should not be a burden on the state, but mobilize the Christian community in Ghana and abroad. Searching personal spiritual assistance to ensure victory and to maintain power is regarded as a normal thing for presidents to do. From the first President Nkrumah to J.J. Rawlings, who was rumored to rely on traditional powers from the Volta region, to the late President Atta Mills, who put his trust in the Nigerian prophet T.B. Joshua, to Akufo-Addo, who consulted the prophet Owusu Bempah of Glorious Word and Power Ministries. The latter is now boasting about his capacity to forecast the future. After all, Akufo-Addo became president and made a number of highly contested prophecies for which he was forced to apologize, including announcing the imminent death of the national chief imam, who is in his late 90s at the moment. As a religious matter still to be constructed but already hotly debated, the National Cathedral Project offers an exquisite case to explore how the public place and role of religion, in this case Christianity, is negotiated and how this may affect the religious environment. Akufo-Addo's National Cathedral initiative is strongly supported by many Christians. It is embraced especially by major Pentecostal churches, with Duncan Williams acting as the chairman of the project, while the historical mission churches have some reservations. Pentecostals in particular see the current era as payback time and have high expectations about divine blessings, of which a national cathedral is a welcome sign. Many people I spoke to, including also some Muslims, saw no problem at all with the president championing such a project, also against the background of the secular constitution. The broad appeal of the project signals an ever-increasing Pentecostalization of politics and society that is carried along by many Christians who appreciate the country to be governed by born-again politicians. Many people told me that as Christians are in the majority, it is perfectly appropriate to build a national cathedral for them, even though there is no national mosque, in contrast to Nigeria, where there is. Some found also that Islam is growing so fast, with many new mosques being built, including a big mosque funded by Turkey, so they felt a threat of pending Islamization, echoing broader global evangelical and secularist ressentiments. And in addition, they argued, the state, after all, had started to accommodate Muslims doing the Hajj, with building a Hajj village to host pilgrims prior to and after their trip, and also made possible direct flights to Mecca from the northern town of Tamale. It is proposed that Christians could perhaps also receive such state support for visiting Jerusalem, the target of many evangelical pilgrimages, which are understood indeed as crusades to the Holy Land and welcomed by Israel. But there are also critical voices, of course, of people who found the National Cathedral project to be at loggerheads with the project of development, especially in the light of faulting medical services and lack of educational facilities, and who feared for conflicts that break up the so far relatively peaceful coexistence of Muslims and Christians. As one of my colleagues and friends, Professor Rabiatu Ahmad told me, for example, about her research in a suburb. People had said, fitna is asleep until you touch it. There already is a growing sense of animosity, which is also fed by larger geopolitical trends and lines of support for the building of mosques and Islamic clinics from countries in the Middle East, Turkey and Iran on the one hand, and a mobilization of global evangelical Christianity. One of my colleagues, Johnson Bieler, suggested to see the National Cathedral project as an instance of what he called the religionization of politics and the politicization of religion, a global process that also shows in what he called Trumpism and the rise of evangelicalism as President Trump's major constituency. As longtime officer of Procmura, a Christian association that seeks to facilitate peaceful coexistence of Muslims and Christians across Africa, Mbila embraces secularism as a viable option for living together with religious differences. In his view, secularism does not mean that religion will not be present in public, as many people might fear, but that the state is supposed to be neutral and politicians refrain from mobilizing their religion all the time. The point is not that people cease expressing their religion in public, but that state officials and politicians refrain from doing so. For if they openly privilege one religion over another, this may challenge peaceful coexistence. To what extent his view will be embraced is an open question which I plan to pursue and follow up. Mbila's concern was shared by local politician James Bomfey, who went to court even twice to contest what he saw as an undue entanglement of the state with religion with regard to facilitating the Hajj and the national cathedral. But his case was dismissed very recently on 23 January 2019. And the Supreme Court argued that the Constitution, while secular in nature, affirms and maintains the historical, cultural and religious or atheist, which is remarkable, atheist character of Ghanaian society. Obviously, another interesting term here, secularism in the context of Ghana, of the Ghana Constitution, must be understood to allow and even encourage state recognition and accommodation of religion and religious identity. Furthermore, the argument was that against the background of the fact that Ghanaians are strongly religious, quote, the state is free to lend support to a religious group. In this sense, the support for the cathedral and the Hajj are conducive to social cohesion and unity. The point made here is instructive to understand the special implications and scope of secularism in Ghana, where it means a guarantee of the freedom of religion and manifestation of belief for all citizens within certain limits that are subject to regulation and mentions, but all the same allows for active collaboration of the state with religious group for the good of the nation. The point here is that secularism does not exclude an active engagement of the state with religious groups in ways that may look to some, as Bomfey, for example, as what he called an excessive entanglement. This quite broad take on secularism as encouraging proactive state involvement with religious matters, such as the national cathedral, stretches the term to the limits. It seems that the state, while regulating certain religious practices in the name of secularism, has a basic need for religion and is not interested in a more narrow secularism in the sense of a stricter separation of church and state. The state needs, embraces and uses religion, and this impacts on the way in which secularism is understood legally and culturally, and thus how certain religions are enabled to go public in the pluralistic religious environment. Practically, this is very much in support of Pentecostalisation. Does this wide understanding of secularism by the court warrant to say that the secular does not exist in Ghana, that it just made a superficial appearance? I do not think so. The point rather is that the term secularism remains ambivalent. On the one hand, religion became a separate category apart from the political and was subsequently even taken as a distinctive characteristic of Africans' natural religiosity in early colonial times. On the other hand, this splitting up was never fully accomplished, in that the dimension of what people call the spiritual is present and materializes in all domains of life, politics included. So might this ambivalence be a repercussion of pre-colonial societal configurations in modern times? Much more could be said here, but for the purposes of this lecture, the point I hope to have conveyed is that the focus on pertinent public religious matters in the double sense of material forms and matters of concern in a wider religious environment may be helpful to understand how the publicness of religion depends on specific legal and political arrangements of the relation between state and religion. And from here we move to the Netherlands, where Christianity is now in massive decline. During roughly 1920 and 1970, the country was pillarized according to religious and cultural lines, yielding separate groups defined on the basis of religion and worldview that lived more or less next to each other and formed parallel social institutions and organizations, including schools, media, banks, and so on. This was predicated on a secular formation in which the state guaranteed not only the individual freedom of belief, as usual in the scope of the law, but also accommodated the possibility for religious and other groups to construct religious buildings and schools, which is established through Article 6 and 23. And until now, half of the schools in the Netherlands are religious or worldview yeah, I don't know the English word for it. But so, yeah, indeed. And only 50% are so-called public schools. The end of pillarization and concomitant possibilities for gender equality and sexual freedom occurred at a time when Islam and other religious traditions, embraced especially by migrants and post-migrants, started to rise. This is perceived as a mismatch, especially by those who longed not only for personal liberation from the grip of Christianity, very much the 60s generation, but also for the disappearance of religion in society. And the presence of Islam is very often criticized from this angle. In the current Netherlands, 49% of the population is a member of a religious organization, of which 24% are Catholic, 15% are Protestant if you add them all up, 5% Muslim, 6% other, and this includes Hindus, Buddhists, and so on. The legal arrangement that grant freedom of religion and the right to establish educational institutions grounded in a religious worldview are still in place and recurred to by the new religious groups who also know their rights. The material manifestations of religious movements, especially Muslims, receive a lot of attention from journalists and scholars. And rightly so, we could say, as a great deal of tensions and conflicts arise in the interface of religion and secularity, especially with regard to Islam, as current commotions about the representation of the Prophet Muhammad's circumcision, ritual slaughter, and Islamic dress styles show. However, the heightened attention to, from a native Dutch perspective, unfamiliar religious items and related practices and ideas in the context of Unchurching should not make us overlook the presence of the more conventional material culture of Christianity and the ways in which it has long shaped public spaces in relation to which religious newcomers have to position themselves. The environment contains not only the material stuff of active Christian traditions, but also remnants such as abandoned church buildings that are up for new purposes. In this rapidly unchurching country, 2 to 3 churches are closing every week, and this is much discussed and really a matter of concern for many. While the framework of secularization and unchurching is focused on the decline of Christianity in terms of church membership and attendance, so quite abstract numbers, a material approach asks explicitly about Christian matters. Unchurching is a massive endeavor which involves many actors: the church congregations, clergy, real estate agents, museums, artists, and heritage institutions. As religious matters, church buildings and the artifacts they contain offer a formidable entry point for grasping the dynamics of the religious environment of the Netherlands as a whole. Following the biography of such buildings and objects vertically through time and situating them horizontally in the current context of religious coexistence or religious secular coexistence allows to understand how the remnants of the Christian past and what my colleague Dan Bakers calls their sacred residue are related to new religious matters. Particularly interesting is the apparent strong attachment of even or especially people who do no longer regard themselves as Christian, but still hold these buildings in high esteem and regard them as valuable forms of Christian cultural heritage. This points to a process of the heritagization of Christianity as a cultural tradition to be appreciated beyond the level of belief and commitment, as part of a European culture, or even its hijacking, to invoke Mazuki, MacDonald, and Roy, as a cradle of European identity. This standpoint is often mobilized in relation to an emergent culturalization of citizenship, which is used in exclusivist terms and speaks to the discontents of many with regard to religious and cultural diversity. In the remainder of this lecture, I want to focus on the religious matters that are loosened from their original Christian frame, so we could call them icons of unchurching. Here you see a set of pictures showing the, to some extent I would say, surreal display of images of Jesus and or Mary in second-hand stores in Amsterdam. Placed in such a strange company of other mundane objects, these images and figures appear to me as matters not so much out of place, but perhaps matters out of time, making me wonder about their previous locations and the trajectory that made them end up here, being for sale and soon moving into new rooms or public settings. For me, images of Mary and Jesus condense religious human object entanglements in optima forma, with persons having prayed, wept, rejoiced, meditated in front of these figures, and perhaps venerated them as intermediaries between humans and God. To some they may appear as kitsch, but I find them highly effective, almost as epitomes of Catholic sensational forms that I'm quite curious about. These artifacts invite us to trace, to invoke Sigrid Weigel, the afterlife and continued effects of past patterns of interpretation, image forms and codes as they are discussed in current image practices and debates around them. They were part of a devotional practice common in Dutch Catholicism, leftovers from what is called het rijke Roomse leven, that was gradually abandoned, both through people leaving the church and transformations of Catholic devotion practices in the aftermath of Vaticanum II. David Morgan has coined the term visual piety to indicate that cultural operation whereby images were transformed into something revelatory, inviting beholders to identify one's sensation with those of a depiction. Much more could be said about the role of images in Dutch Catholic devotional practices, but my point here is their appearance as religious matters out of use. To understand the array of responses these discarded objects evoke, I want to turn to the exhibition Verspijkerd en Verzaagd, held in the Noord-Brabants Museum Den Bosch in the spring of 2017. This exhibition was devoted to the recycling of devotional images in the sphere of art after they were of no use anymore in Catholic churches and homes. And the museum director, Charles de Moy, stated poignantly, "Even though the time is ripe for this exhibition, we are aware that such an overview on recycled devotional images will raise divergent emotions. At the same time, it appears that our Christian heritage here is retained in other ways than we are usually inclined to think. The time was ripe for this exhibition because in the wake of the steady process of unchurching, Christianity is transformed into heritage. The shift of one's sacred objects into the sphere of art is not necessarily smooth." Monsignor Kotte, Bishop of Den Bosch, points out in the same catalogue, if you believe that God came to us in Jesus, such an image can easily be interpreted as blasphemic by believers. But Christians will not quickly throw bombs. No, you need not be afraid that the museum will be attacked, which is also found on the blurb. The bishop explains that both theology and art are entitled to create salubrious confusion, but there is also non-salubrious confusion. This is what can be called blasphemy, albeit from the perspective of the believers. According to him, those who know less about theology may be more inclined to charge an artwork as blasphemous than those who do and who know about the difference between art and religion. His statement fits in with an overall trend on the part of Catholic and Protestant churches to embrace art and to reposition themselves in the current highly secular context of Europe. And I'm very happy that Claire Oliphant is here, who works very much on this issue. The explicit acknowledgement that some artworks may be perceived as blasphemic and that people feel offended is a significant statement made against the backdrop of all recent commotion regarding representations of the Prophet Muhammad in cartoons. The exhibition offers an occasion to take an enlightened position so as to state one's difference with regard to religious fundamentalists, the capacity to tolerate offensive art as a litmus test for secular enlightened citizenship. The exhibition, and I can imagine you may be interested to see what they showed, has two parts. One features artist Jacques Franken, who made artworks from Catholic materials abandoned and discarded in the mid-60s, when Catholic churches were emptied of kitsch and all sorts of images of Mary, Jesus, and the saints were found in the streets. At the time, the process of unchurching started to take off, but the main concern was, in those days, to get rid of cheap plaster images, or the Italian kitsch, as it is often called. Sorry. Franken, and maybe we can just, I don't know whether, no, it doesn't matter. Franken split the statues with a chainsaw and put them together in new ways, which appeared as scandalous to many. Interestingly, he engaged with unchurching, secularization in a very material manner, working with its tangible stuff. His statement that he would not know better than to dig out the old and represent it to the next generation in a new form is telling. I see it as an iconoclasm that reorganizes old elements into a new iconicity in the sphere of art or pop art. Franken's art yielded many protests in the 1960s. It was dismissed as blasphemy and he as Antichrist, but there was no court case. The second part of the exhibition is contemporary, showing that the recycling of images goes on and on. The recycling of discarded religious images as art does not efface their history, but encapsulate it in what Sigrid Weigel calls the dialectics of secularization. In order to render the reuse of a devotional image in the frame of art meaningful, it is necessary to affirm the capacity of the image as a religious object to render present what it depicts. In other words, the recycling of an image of Jesus or Mary as an artwork owes its appeal to acknowledging and surpassing its religious nature of generating divine presence through presumed likeness cherished by previous believing beholders. Of course, experiences and opinions about the exhibition differed widely. I took the guest book as a resource that reveals a broad set of responses to the dialectic of secularization at play here, which may index positions taken with regard to the religious past across Dutch society. And there are many reasons for me to assume this. Many visitors appreciate the exhibition. They say leuk, or are indifferent. Others see the items displayed as sacrilege, heiligschennis, thereby expressing a disgust, which is, I think, grounded in a fundamental cleavage between what they see on display and their embodied attitude to and use of such images in devotional settings. Memory is mobilized, but disappointed and challenged. What is sacred for the beholder and requests a special treatment is treated in a desacralizing, transgressive manner by the artist. Someone also jokingly writes, "Now I know what to do with my grandmother's stuff." Next to visitors with a Catholic family background or Catholic believers, one also finds typical Protestant responses, stating that in the face of these artworks, which may easily be experienced as sacrilegious, it becomes obvious why God does not want to be represented via images. Clearly, repercussions of how Protestantism and Catholicism organized and still organize sensational profiles and stances to images and figuration are still at work, having an afterlife just as the once sacred images and figures. Importantly, many visitors ask whether such sacrilegious art would be possible to make and exhibit with regard to Muhammad, and think that Islam and Muslims can learn something from this. Is there here a potential to better understand the sentiments behind protests by Muslims against the so-called Muhammad caricatures? Or is the message rather that Muslims should tolerate the reconfiguration of what is sacred to them in the frame of art or in the frame of journalism, just as Dutch Catholics are also expected to do here? The comments along this line hark back to the statement of Bishop Korte, which, given its prominence in the blurb, provides a central frame of the exhibition. The exhibition and the discourse evoked by it speak to broader concerns about the representation of Islam in the public sphere that are linked to Catholic and perhaps also Protestant sensitivities and past and present charges of blasphemy from Christian standpoints. Enduring the exhibition may be taken as a test for one's civic capacity to tolerate potentially blasphemic dealings with religious images in a non-religious domain, even if one feels hurt. So these recycled images from a Catholic past are situated in a field in which, on the one hand, their value and sacrality is defended against being squandered by believers and post-believers, while on the other hand, the acceptance that artists are free to blaspheme is emphasized as a distinctive characteristic of Western society. To conclude, my idea was that in focusing and following the rise and decline of religious matters as a method, we can learn something about the shifting roles and places of religions or religious traditions that would remain occluded by taking more conventional approaches towards religion in abstract terms, as belief, for example. The thread of this presentation is a focus on religious matters as entry points into the conditions and modalities in which religions go public in Ghana and the Netherlands. Whereas in Ghana, Christianity is on the rise and traditional objects are discarded as idols, in the Netherlands, Christianity is declining and devotional objects are laid off and recycled for new purposes in the domain of art and heritage. Increasingly, discarded idols from Ghana have long found destinations in Dutch and other European ethnographic museums, which now think about possibilities of returning some of these objects to Africa, while concomitantly discarded devotional objects from Dutch Catholicism have moved to Ghana and found their way into churches, which is an interesting topic for further research. And I could just refer to a really interesting altar made by a famous architect, the architect of Rijksmuseum and the Central Station, Pierre Kuipers, whose altar has been brought from a church in Helmond, which was broken down because there was a worm in the wood, to Winneba, where it is now very much popped up, very pinkish and blue, but it is the altar of the Sacred Heart Church. Salient differences exist between the ways in which secularism is made operational. In Ghana, the secularity of the state is understood as a lack that produces a need, thus encouraging proactive state involvement with religious matters, such as the National Cathedral, for the sake of the common good. In the Netherlands, the secularity of the state is understood by and large in terms of the accommodation and regulation of religion, and in mainstream public opinion, it is found problematic that this accommodation for a great deal pertains to religious newcomers at a time when Christianity is losing ground and its material culture is reappreciated as heritage. But though these differences are considerable, it is important to realize that these settings do not exist in isolation from each other, as also the crossover as the objects to which I just referred spotlights. In our entangled world, people and objects move between these spheres. While many people in Europe may comfortably forget about Africa and the historical reality of slave trade and colonialism, those on the continent have Europe on the radar. Europe's others, who were ideologically and conceptually distanced through colonialism and deemed to be far away, are now co-present witnesses of unchurching and heritagization of Christianity and part of complex pluralist religious environments in which they have to accommodate to the secularism Dutch style, which is another topic for further research for which a focus on religious matters may prove to be fruitful. Thank you for your attention.
Birgit, thank you very much. It was incredibly rich and, as always, with your presentations and your work full of fantastic images. It was very nice to see you expanding into the Netherlands, kind of turning the ethnographic gaze on the nation in which you've lived and worked for many years. I want to actually tell an anecdote, if I might, by way of helping formulate a question or a comment, and ask you to reflect a bit more on. Back in the 90s, my wife and I, or then girlfriend, but anyway, it doesn't matter. We're living in Prague, and she was doing her research. As you know, she's an anthropologist as well, and she bought a small orange bag because she thought it was cool. And when she went out with this bag, her local friends would laugh at, where did you get this bag? And she said that she bought it in some shop. And they said, that's a gas mask bag to protect us from American, invasions. In the this was the Cold War was still, not that far away. And of course she had no idea. Now I use the bag for my lunch. But the point is, I mean, here was an object which had to a particular community a very specific meaning, indeed, an iconic meaning and signification, which was completely lost on us. And I tell that anecdote just because I think it helps kind of crystallize a question, I think, especially around the material you were discussing with respect to the Netherlands, because you referred to this as matter out of, well, you said it wasn't really matter of place, it's kind of a matter out of time, right? I mean, and it's interesting to reflect, as the artist did in the 1960s, when the recognizability of these objects or these semiotic forms will fade, such that they no longer have the resonances that they still clearly do in terms of being recognizably religious objects, even if they are repurposed. And I wanted to ask you to reflect a bit more on the questions of time and how time, temporality relates to the object and the circulation, especially because recycling, that very kind of metaphor or way of articulating it, also introduces a certain kind of temporality with preservation, perhaps for new or reuse. And I guess I wanted to ask you to reflect a bit more on how kind of temporality plays in here, and linking that to Ghana, ask, to what extent is the rhetoric around the proposal for this national cathedral tied to the temporality of modernity or modernization or Ghana's arrival? Is the political discourse in any way organized around the importance of this for the extent to which it will signal Ghana's emplacement within modernity?
It's very interesting that you bring in temporality. This paper had a longer version in which I went much more deeply into questions of time and waste. But I felt it was already long, so I had to leave that out. But I'm very much interested, indeed, in a way the production and circulation of certain objects that no longer have the purpose that they were made for. And indeed, the world is full of this. History is waste production, and a great deal of waste is unrecognized, goes somewhere, or is recycled into something else. It's very, very interesting to think about history in such terms, or perhaps even our own private lives, all the stuff that one in certain moments wants to get rid of, including all the associations perhaps that come with it. So there is something to waste, time, a sense of history that I find interesting in general. But what I found very striking with regard to both the so-called idols and the Catholic stuff is that they are discarded items. They are indeed taken out of the context in which they would have functioned. They float, and it is not easy. People feel uneasy in certain ways in relating to them. Well, in Ghana, of course, one has learned to be afraid of idols and to detest them, and finds it very difficult to embrace them as heritage. In the Netherlands, well, some of these once esteemed forms can be embraced as heritage, at least by some people, but it is difficult. So you see that in a way heritage making, which sounds in a way like a kind of embedding in perhaps a more routinized memory culture, Erinnerungskultur, is not that easy. It is very complicated. And I think I also read some work by an anthropologist, I think Viney, which I just bumped into, which I found very interesting, who writes also about waste as having an excessive temporality that disturbs, that messes up. And I'm very much interested in a way in taking this project further, but then it can't be contained within one lecture. by going deeper into the question of waste and this excessive temporality. For these are items that in a way belong to another time, and yet they are in the here and now, and they pose questions, and they disturb, and they can be tabooed, and they can be done away with, but they are still disturbing in all kinds of ways. I also do think, I very much agree that the building of the national cathedral, you also saw the model, and so it is indeed part of framing Ghana as this modern country, modern Christian country, and all that. And at the backside, indeed, there is this question of the idol and how to put some of the stuff in a neat frame to cherish the national heritage. But this is very, very difficult. I do still think, and I think my whole work on Pentecostalism in Ghana also thrives on this logic, that there is a very, very uneasy coexistence of the idol or the fetish, and the terms are used interchangeably in this context, and in a way the Christian cathedrals and all that. So that's, and I think what a focus on religious matters at least helps me get more aware of is in a way this potential and the excess and the clashes. I think that's what I could say about this. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great questions.
Brian.
Thanks very much, Birgit, for the talk. I was very shocked with the comparison of what comes out of the comparison is the constant movement. A constant movement. There's a waxing and a waning. There's waning in the Netherlands, there's waxing in Ghana in a certain sense. But they're not just one-way movements, they're changing from one thing into another. So it's waning in the Netherlands, but it's changing into heritage and art, and by virtue of that, there's a doubling down on civilizational divide. This becomes a new way of stigmatizing Muslims and keeping them separate because they don't have the tolerance and they can't understand art, and they have this iconoclastic relationship to it. So a familiar opposition is re-articulated in this new guise. And then also, and I'm not sure about the film scene in Ghana anymore, but to go back to your work on religion and media, on the films, similar to Nigeria, there's a doubling down, this intensification of religion in the film. But now, certainly in Nigeria, with the shift towards the multiplexes, there's been an iconoclastic excision of religion from the films that get onto the satellite television now. They're militantly secular. I mean, there might be types of religion, but they're certainly not religion in the way that the films you analyse were. They're slick, they're modern, everyone with digital cultures, and they keep that world away from it. So in both the world you're giving us, we have this sort of there's it's not just nothing stable in this sense, and it's not even that Ghana's becoming much more religious, or Nigeria's becoming much more religious. There's also these countercurrents in all these places as well. So with that, to go back to your canonical three things of religion, secular, politics, how do those concepts stay constant when the dynamics you're looking at that you give us are so constantly changing all the time? And if you go to a sort of Rontier idea of how do we assign something in place, or how do you as a scholar assign something in place, religion or secular, when everything is changing so much, how do you bring that dynamism to thinking about these big categories?
I think you give a great summary, and I really find it very important and interesting to think about not only new religions rising. I think as scholars we have an inclination to be there. I think it is very important to look at what rises and what fades and wanes, and I really want to call more attention for this. Also one colleague, Michael Stausberg in Bergen, in religious studies, is also interested in religions that end in a way. And of course there is a lot of religious traditions that maybe recur to the certain elements have afterlives, but they are fading. And I think it's very, very important to get this kind of larger picture. And in a way it's mediated through this kind of waste production, which obviously I find very interesting. It is indeed, I struggled very much how to find a useful structure and to describe all these processes. And in fact what I did intend to do, of course, is in this longer sketch of Ghana, because I thought this setting is less familiar perhaps to you than the Netherlands, but I may be totally mistaken, is of course to show that to say at least that I'm very much aware that in pre-colonial times it made not much sense. So then I say, in those days, the political, the social, the economic were not yet separated. So it's a retrospect thing. But I don't have a really viable language to express this, I think. So that is why I recur to certain categories of which I'm very much aware, I think we all are aware, that they are enmeshed, that there is a problem with their distinction, because it in certain ways reproduces a modernist sociological take on modern society as being compartmentalized and all that. This is to some extent the case, but to some extent it definitely is not. And the question is, of course, how we as scholars have to, in a way, make our categories more mobile without losing a kind of critical purchase for analysis. So for me, you address a pertinent problem, but also a big conceptual problem that is not so easy for me to now solve. But maybe you have an...
I just found it, if we get to the classic things of the problem that we know now, that religion is a Christian category, both of these other traditions, that the secular science of place to religion and things like that. We then move to a certain stasis, that this happened and this fixed. If we then go with the dynamism, that nothing is fixed, that both this categorization, this assigning of place, is constantly mutable and constantly intentional. So one could say in Ghana, or certainly Nigeria, does religion, even though the constitution is secular, does religion assign place to the secular rather than the other way around? One could think in different terms, and I can imagine there's a process to that rather than a simple statement.
Okay, I also see where you head to. I'm also very much fascinated by relational approaches. I also said religion comes in the plural, the multiplicity should be the starting point, but I do think that we witness many closures that are being made. So I don't think that we are totally done with the categories. I do think, well, that religion was introduced as a term, and then something very complex and enmeshed and whole, very much perhaps in the sense of what you are now referring to, became ATR, traditional religion, and became then even the prime qualifier of African people. They are irredeemably, incurably religious, which is a very, very problematic statement, because now the term religion is used to narrow down something which in fact did not allow to be narrowed down. Hence my critical reflection about that. But I do think that we see this kind of streamlining and disciplining always at work. And I do think that something like secularism or even secularization is a kind of streamlining, disciplining mechanism that also separates and via the use of categories. So I would say that on the one hand, things are incredibly entangled and complex and so even difficult to describe with our conventional language. But on the other hand, there are always closures, distinctions, boundaries, and so on being produced. You may find it interesting that in Bayreuth just got a big cluster of excellence project called Africa Multiple, and I think they want to think about Africa indeed by taking multiplicities as a starting point, which is very exciting. But also in my discussions with some people there, I always think the relational and the kind of the unrelating should become and be seen together. That would be, my answer for now.
Elaine, sorry. Elaine.
I have three related questions. I'm going to try to be really, really concise. Following up on this point, I think it would be interesting to see you kind of looking at how these are more similar than they appear. So how the Ghanaian National Cathedral shares a lot in common with an anxiety around the de-churching of a space. Yeah. So that how are they both religious, political spaces? Mm-hmm. How do they embody the nation as much as they point to something beyond. You know, how is the a deconsecrated church similar to, that still has to maintain its exterior form, and how is it similar to the Venetian National Cathedral? And similarly, the kind of the relationship between sensational forms and the less sensational forms, seemingly more mundane forms. Mm-hmm. Because I think a lot of sensational forms, particularly in Catholic traditions, can point to much more mundane things as well as God. They can point to the patron who paid for their production. They could point to the political, certain things in the feudal structure. They could point to the local community that they were celebrated in. So they were never just about pointing to God. They were pointing to a multiplicity of things. And so seemingly banal, mundane forms can also be quite sensational. They can also, something like clothing and dress can emphasize their timelessness, emphasize their relatedness to God. And I also thought that was interesting in relation to this recycling, because in Europe the biggest iconoclast has been the Catholic Church destroying its own stuff. Like the Reformation was considered to be a big iconoclastic moment, but it was actually the kind of counter-Reformation of the church that destroyed a lot of its medieval forms and replaced them with the Baroque, and recycled them and like repurposed them and dressed them up in kind of Renaissance clothing. And there's and then the very movement of these things into museums. They've been sort of transformed into artworks. Crucifixes have been transformed into artworks for a long time through just their very existence in the exhibition space. Yeah. And I think another kind of fascinating twist here is that because Vatican II has demanded the kind of reformate, the changes a lot of churches, especially with altars, so that you have the priest behind the altar. They've actually been limited in doing that in a lot of European countries because of heritage laws that insist that the church has to maintain its original structure, whatever that means. So they have to come up with a lot of creative solutions about how to put in an altar that the priest can actually stand behind in order to face the congregation. So I feel like there's just a lot of room to think about these things together, that the matter kind of exceeds these categories, and there's a way that these sensational forms are doing a lot of political work, and they have been for a long time.
Yeah. Well, this is very helpful, and I struggled. I said also to Matthew, because I really just finished this paper. It was too long and it didn't have a conclusion, whatever. So it was really, and I felt that these two different strands, they are both for me very instructive, and I can learn a lot about, kind of production management of waste in all kinds of ways, of how things flow are redeployed and all that. But it is not so easy to bring them together clearly, but I also do think that the whole narrative doesn't really allow for, I talk about Ghana or Africa and Europe as entangled, so it wouldn't allow for a very neat kind of differentiation. But I do agree that indeed the use of sensational forms in the context, we could say certain political theologies and so on, can be compared and is in many ways more similar perhaps than I might have emphasized. I also very much agree with your point about iconoclasm as being an intrinsic Catholic phenomenon. In fact, I referred to Jacques Franken as this artist who got all kinds of, what was seen a bit as the kitschy stuff. So on the plaster images, yes, that had to go in the aftermath of Vaticanum II. And before, there have been numerous kind of iconoclasms inflicted upon the Catholic Church from within, of course, so in the aftermath of the Council of Trent and everything. So yes, and I think that is something I could have, it would be good if I would make a longer paper to emphasize that. And then on the mundane, yes, I'm also with you. I don't want to make such a strong kind of exclusive differentiation, but I do. So I think a lot about religious matters that become bones of contention. But I would say that in a way, the building of a mosque or the breaking down of a cathedral, these are other religious matters than whether something just concerns Muslim dress. It's just a dress, so there's nothing special, extraordinary about that. But these are all religious matters that can become matters of contention. So I wanted to keep up the possibility to distinguish there. That is what I meant when very much, I think, a bit in passing, I said the mundane and then the extraordinary. And it's not so strictly different, but there are certain differences, I think, in the religious matters which we work in our project. Yeah. But thanks. So these are very good, very great, helpful comments.
Here in New York, we have can be found in Latino ethnic neighborhoods, Bronx or other Manhattan, all throughout the city, in Latino ethnic neighborhoods such as Puerto Rican, Dominican, and probably other cultures of Central and South America. We have stores that are called botanicas. You're familiar with that, botanicas. And the botanicas sell images of saints, Catholic saints, and probably Mary and so forth, Jesus as well. But I have read that based on the Afro-Caribbean Yoruba tradition, these statues, these figures are not venerated as traditional as Saint Michael or Gabriel or Jesus or Mary, but they are substituted. These people are nominally Roman Catholic, but essentially they are venerating, they are worshiping traditional African deities. So my question is this the case in Ghana as well, where people who anthropologists would consider to be animists or practitioners of traditional African faiths, pantheist, animist, would be acquiring these figurines and not worshiping traditional Catholic personages of divinity, but rather worshiping via these statues traditional African deities and gods and spirits.
This is an interesting question. It makes me think immediately of the work of my colleague, Matthijs van der Poort, who has been working on candomblé and who has been, indeed, there are also other authors working on this, and who has been, exploring indeed how behind images of saints there stand Yoruba deities that are also being called upon. This has to do, of course, with the oppression of African Brazilians for a long time in Brazil, who were also not allowed, in a way, to worship their gods, which linked them up with Africa. Once the police ceased to raid the terreiros, there were possibilities to come out for this and to establish candomblé, even as some priestesses also wanted, as a religion on its own that could get rid of, do away with the syncretism, as it were, that had been there before. So that is what comes to my mind immediately. In Ghana, I have worked a lot with Protestants, and since Protestants normally learn to not put their heart onto figurines, it doesn't mean that there is nothing around. I did not come across this at all. I have not conducted research on Catholicism myself, but my colleague Annalisa Buttici is doing research on Saint Antonio, and is very much interested how Antonio has been, Saint Antonia, has been incorporated into traditional practice. So that is a move of, in a way, bringing a figure of the saint into traditional practices. And I could imagine, but I do not know in how far also the reverse would be true. That would be very interesting to pursue. So thank you for the suggestion.
Yes.
And I hope to bump into some of these shops.
You can find them in East Harlem and all over the Bronx, etc., etc.
Very interesting.
I'll show it.
Very good.
Just to follow up on his, I don't know if people know, the word voodoo means sacred. That was a European slackdown of religion. The word voodoo means sacred. On your quick picture, this is where the rosary comes from in the Catholic Church. It's older. This comes from Ethiopia. It's a mascal. The Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, 12 apostles, tree of life. When you said religion, because I was told religion means return to the allegiance to the family. You mentioned Sankofa, your bird, because it happens to be my business card. That's Sankofa, and it means it is not taboo to return to the past, to retrieve what was lost, stolen, taken from you, from an Akan king in Ghana. I thought you, when you mentioned you was in Ghana, I thought you would know that. And have you ever heard, my main question, of Manny Banji Dakwa, professor in Ghana, who wrote the book, The Africans Who Wrote the Bible?
No, I don't know that.
You need to find it before you finish your paper.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Okay, but you know, voodoo, just on that. So I have been working a lot with Ewe people. And of course, the gods of the Ewe are called Vaudin. And this term, of course, also has moved with people who were enslaved to Haiti, Jamaica, and so on. And it became voodoo. It was written in different ways. Then it was hijacked very much by Hollywood. So we have a certain idea about what voodoo is through these kinds of movies. And then, interestingly, the idea of voodoo and the term voodoo gets back to Africa, also to Nigeria, where people, women who are into sex work, for example, claim that they have pledged to voodoo priests who don't exist in those areas in Nigeria, and for that reason somehow find it difficult to move out. So I find that very, very interesting. But for Ewe people, Vaudin is a generic, Southern Ewe people, it's a generic term for gods. And of course for Sankofa, I'm very much aware, it is an Adinkra a symbol, and I know what it means, of course. That indeed it is no shame to turn back to the past. And this symbol was very much employed by Nkrumah and also other presidents in order to indicate the importance of looking back so as to move forward. But they have very much deployed it as a kind of policy also for heritage making and for revaluing the past, also in the context of this very strong drive towards modernization, which made many people forget about tradition, about African values, and all that. However, as I try to show, and I have written about that in my work, this project has also been contested because especially many Christians are not so fond of the Sankofa project, especially the Pentecostals, because they want to move forward without looking back.
Okay, I'm sorry, sir. We need to get on to the next.
What was the question?
I'm sorry, we have several other people.
Okay. We can continue after when we closed.
Yeah, maybe afterwards there might be time. Rajbir.
I'm a South Asianist, put that out there. I just had a conceptual question in terms of beginning with multiplicity and then showing the multiplicity of use of Jesus, for example.
Of what?
Of like Jesus, the statue of Jesus.
Yeah.
And then putting that in relationship to Islam. Doesn't this like reproduce that logic of who is like the normative subject for modernity? That would be one.
Can you explain it a bit more?
Because we're beginning with multiplicity, and then we're shown, right, how Christian, and that's the argument, right, that we have the capacity to see Jesus in multiple ways, right, as an aesthetic object, as well as a religious object, right, in multiple uses. And they use that, right, as you showed, to talk about Islamic obstinacy. So doesn't that replay the normative project of Christian, right, multiplicity against Islam?
Yeah, of course it does. And that was also my point, to show how, in fact, even this exhibition of these kinds of images triggers certain standpoints and can, in that sense, also be taken as a kind of civic test or exercise to assert a certain civic capacity, which is considered very civilized and supreme, and against which is played off against Muslims, which also means we can accept you if you are able to do the same when we make Muhammad images, which is already a very weird kind of argument. But what I did, of course, I tried to understand and analyze the guest book and the positions that are being formulated, and I found it interesting. Why would a guest book have so many references to Islam and to images of Muhammad? I had not expected this, and I found it really something to think about, and saw how, in fact, this kind of exhibition is being employed and used by people to establish a particular, ethical, political standpoint. And I want to document this. I do not think that this is right or that this is the thing, but I wanted to document this, right?
In South Asia, it's just how, you see it a lot, really.
Yeah.
There's this claim towards multiplicity, and then, right, just to reject Islam. I just wonder what happens.
Yeah. But I didn't.
It's just something I think about a lot too.
Yeah.
What happened in our project?
Yeah.
We begin with multiplicity as the ground. That was
Okay, but I said we should begin with multiplicity, and it's also, in a way, a reflection about my own work. For I have long started with, for example, a particular church, the Evangelical Presbyterian Church. And now I, in a way, have come to think that it makes much more sense in the project which we are running to not just look at a particular religious movement from within. I do think that both the anthropology of Islam and the anthropology of Christianity have created very good work, but they made us very much focus on particular religious movements from within. So when I said multiplicity should be the default, I also mobilized this idea of the in-between space, that Zwischenraum. And I really think that that is a very, very good starting point, so as to avoid perhaps in the end somewhat essentializing, although the word is maybe too strong and I don't want to too much criticize certainly the anthropology of Islam. I have, I think, more problems with certain strands in the anthropology of Christianity. But so one would not want to think about these as traditions that one can study just by themselves. So that was my idea. And so then looked at, I think I said the the limbo, the Zwischenraum in which, also traditions in a way rub against each other, overlap, and so on. But that would be my scholarly take on it. And in this, I'm interested how people in a pluralistic context, in a way, position themselves and mobilize themselves, often in highly stereotyped manners. But that is something I document. So one always has to, or I try to keep these two apart, as it were. Yeah. But my analysis should not reconfirm these kind of differentiations, and it should, of course, not conceptually go for a kind of cheap pluralism, a normative cheap pluralism that claims equality, which is not there. If it were, one would not need pluralism, right? No.
Thank you. Sam, was it on this?
It was. Well, I mean, it's not. I was just wondering, because we were talking about going to the US book and finding the messages that were written. This is not a deep question, but for those of us who don't speak Dutch, I wonder if you could pull up that slide and maybe read one of those, or just you could even say what the nature of the messages are that are left. I mean, I kind of think we can maybe anticipate what they are, but.
Well, there's a penis there. So
That's not the one.
That was now here for here. This was the peacetime.
The Netherlands or America, and that's actually in English.
Okay. So could you, zou je dit ook met Mohammed kunnen doen? Could you also do this with Mohammed? The Islam could learn something from it. A smiley. Why? How so? beledigen, an offense of the prophet. Fantastic. So this kind of statements you see. Or someone who says, this is de beelden zijn realistisch in de denkwijze van nu. The images are realistic in the way in which we now think. Interesting statement. Or hiervan, ik begrijp iets beter waarom God zegt dat we beter geen beelden van hem zouden kunnen maken. Geen beeld van hem. Now I understand better why God says that we better make no images of him, for example. So these are very ironic, interesting kind of things, yeah.
And why is the penis there? I can see it, but I don't know why it's there. Why did the person
What was this?
draw this?
Oh yeah, I think just like that apart. So here is it. Nou weet ik wat ik met de spullen van mijn oma mag gaan doen. This came separate. Now I know what to do with my grandma's stuff and that's what my mom and so on. And here someone says creatief met godsdienst. There has been a Dutch program, creatief met kerk, which is a kind of funny thing where people use what is cork? Cork? Is it cork? No, what you have in a wine bottle.
Yeah, cork.
Cork, yeah.
Yeah.
Creative with cork, and so creative with religion. But this is a kind of fun program. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know why the penis is there actually. Yeah. Or someone says sommige voorstellingen zijn mooi, sommige zijn ontzettend lelijk. Zelf ben ik afvallig en laat alles verder met rust. So some are nice, some are not like, but I'm afvallig, also interesting. So I left. It's not a usual thing you say when you are a Catholic. So I don't know what this person is, but afvallig is really strange. Yeah. So it's endless. It's a really interesting guest book, I have to say, and one could write much more about it. So I now did it quickly.
So Diane.
A quick question. Are discarded sacred items in Ghana put in museums there? So they don't have a problem with putting it in a museum?
No, there is a museum, but the museum is not in well, I have not visited it for long. It is not in a very good shape. And many of these items have also gone with missions to ethnographic museum, to certain collections, of course.
I know they're put abroad. I mean, we celebrate that our museums are crammed, wonderful.
Yes, but there is a real...
But they don't do it so much, or they do it, but it's marginalized.
It's not very big, but there are. In Ghana, I did not notice so far a very strong museum movement, and also not a movement calling for the return of images. This is different, for example, for Nigeria, but then, of course, the items at stake are very big. So there is a big difference between types of items we have in our museums here, in ethnographic museums. There is looted art, of course, like the Benin bronzes and such kind of things. And there are then this kind of products which Christians were to do away with, so which had no value for them. They are now all in museums, and they get a new kind of exhibition value as secular heritage items. And some things are now in the process of being demanded back, and there are many debates about the need to give it back or not. Maybe you heard about the Savoir-Sa report about the return. It was an advice to President Macron about the return of art objects from French museums, French public museums, to Africa, which fueled a huge discussion. But I heard very little about this with regard to Ghana, actually.
We had the same repatriation of Native American sacred objects going on here. It's quite an active debate.
And I find it an interesting process, because indeed one has to take the circulation of the things into account. And I do think that in the claiming back, of course, what is claimed back is another object. It is an object that has been revalued and reframed in the museum. And through this, of course, again, it is a kind of, perhaps a dialectic of secularization as well. There is attribution still of the kind of perhaps sacred religious value of the object in an African context, which is then in a way enhanced and aggrandized by the value attributed to the collector, by the museum that exhibits it. And so when an object comes back, it comes back with all these values. And I think that is something that perhaps in the discussion also around the report could be more emphasized. But I found the report actually incredibly interesting. So this is another project one should and could pursue. And it's right in line with this whole idea of waste that becomes meaningful or not, that it has an excessive, disturbing presence, exactly also because of this enshrined temporality.
Yeah, Zay.
Thank you. So really, this is more like a comment or a reflection, and it connects with this idea of enshrined temporality. So, and with your idea of matter out of time, because I was actually thinking about the religious movement I studied in Brazil, which is the Catholic movement. It's a Catholic Pentecostal movement, and they went through this phase that they wanted to receive the breath of the Holy Spirit, so they didn't want to have much to do with images, although being Catholic, it's rather ambiguous. And so naturally I was talking about images, so what's going to happen to images, and many of these early Catholic Pentecostals were trying to get rid of their images in order to promote the idea of the body and so on. But one interesting thing that we come across sometimes is that when talking about broken images, was that there was a certain, while they didn't want to have the whole image there was a certain admiration for the fragments. And what they would say about the fragment, it was that the fragment, the endurance, that the image was able to endure.
Yeah.
So I was thinking about your idea of matter out of time as that which is no longer there. But what if we would think that as in those art forms, that there's something about the capacity of the image to still be there, to endure itself, despite the attempts to transform it, that could produce precisely that kind of religious feeling. So it would no longer be about that which is no longer there, but about that which is still there. You see, so what I'm saying here is that because charismatics are into aerobics, so they're very much into endurance. So the capacity of the image to endure. Right?
Yeah, I find it interesting. I immediately think of your piece on the FedEx saint. So where you write about you visit someone and then somehow a statue falls and gets, it falls into pieces. And the lady is not upset because somehow she didn't feel good about having that thing anyhow. So that is a really that was a really intriguing case, and I agree with this. And I do. I do think that I'm very fond of the work of Sigrid Weigel actually, and I think it will soon be available in English. Grammatologie der Bilder.
Is he the one who does the crucifix with the skirt?
Yeah, no, that was a nice. Weigel is a.
It could be that the skirt will cover fully, but it doesn't.
Exactly.
So there's a resistance.
Exactly. Now this is also something to write a very big thing, and many people writing in the guest book found this very cute and remarked the Jesus mit der Tutu is fantastic. So they were very, very fond of this. But so what Sigrid Weigel writes, and I refer to this only very briefly, is this dialectic of secularization, which indeed implies for her that the image, though in a way reframed and changed, always retains something of that of its past, and it is reactivated. So it is never a kind of transfer of images from one place to the other.
But that resistance precisely against new erratic power, new force. That's where the sacred comes in that moment.
Yeah, and that I don't think that she is going into that direction so much, but I think this would be an interesting yeah, I agree. So I can think about that. I can think about that further. Yeah.
So Birgit, one final question, or ask you to reflect on something, because the project that we're undertaking, RCPL, is moving towards comparison, towards bringing certain regions of the world into the same frame, and bringing together experts on Africa and South Asia in various forums. It's absolutely fine that you didn't move towards South Asia, but rather the Netherlands. But it raises a more general question. Is this, do you see this as, is this comparative work? And I mean, picking up on Rajvir's point about multiplicities, which would seem to push against the idea that this is actually a comparative project, because the logic of multiplicity would suggest that actually it's not comparison per se, which relies on the circumscription of a certain of an object or you know, two things side by side, but rather you're looking at a series of strands and interwoven elements. I wonder if I could just ask you in 2 minutes to reflect on this. I know, because also you've been doing a lot of work which you haven't talked about tonight, but on bringing together experts on Christianity, Islam, Judaism, to think outside of those traditions in relation to a particular theme or problematic, such as images. Is comparison an important endeavor for you, and if so, how would you, kind of define it?
Yeah, well, comparison is important, but I do think, and I think that the practice of comparison is part of what we do as anthropologists. The question is very much how we would define comparison. So if it is a kind of comparison in terms of discrete entities, this is rather dull and problematic, may go into a quite positivistic framework. So even when I say I want to engage in a comparison, I always think about comparison in entangled settings. So one cannot work with really neat kind of categories. But I do think that comparison is very basic to what we do. I pursue comparison also already through practices of translation, for example, which is a very basic form. I think Joanna Overing made that point very well, of comparison. I know that you will soon have Peter van der Veer here with his book, The Value of Comparison. I think he also goes along this quite pragmatic line, so rejecting in a way comparison in terms of these big blocks that are being compared, but still trying to work comparatively, also very much through a very reflexive work on translation. I do think that for me, positioned in European academia, where once you become a more senior scholar, you are expected to also chair larger projects. Comparison is in certain ways unavoidable, because it is that what makes it possible to talk across about the research we are doing. So in certain ways, I see the seminar I run already as comparison, a comparative enterprise. And then people will say, this is very similar to what I encounter in Kenya. And the other person may talk about the Netherlands or Morocco and so on. So you try to work in these ways. You try to do it systematic, but you don't want to end up with this kind of discrete entities, because it relates in a way to the question Brian posed. So multiplicity and separations, boundary making, comparison and entanglement. And for me, these two always come together, I think, yeah. And I find it very necessary, perhaps also, I find it interesting that you, like me, moved from anthropology to religious studies. One always remains anthropologist, I think. Angela could join this conversation, perhaps. But at the same time, I do think that being in religious studies, for me, opens up lots of spaces where I did not go before. And I find that really interesting. So I'm now indeed able, if I want to go deeper into a deeper understanding of image making, Bildgebung, such kind of process, I can engage with art history, with people working on Catholicism and so in a more easy way. So for the time being, I find that refreshing, but that requires a lot of translation between disciplinary vocabularies. Sometimes one doesn't know what colleagues are talking about. It takes quite some effort, yeah. So for me, comparison is practice. Translation, it will create new insights. It may be disturbing and all that. So I go for that basic line. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Birgit, and join me in